We have the inventor of Adventure with us, Warren Robinett. How did Colossal Cave Adventure inspire what you did?
So can you all hear us okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about my game Adventure, which was released in 1979 on the Atari 2600. So right here we have an Atari 2600. In Jim Brown's class yesterday, I talked to the class.
Switch over.
Can we get it set up so that it's on there and the sound? I think the sound has to be
No,
plugged
I
in.
think sound is already connected.
There we go.
Okay. Oh, good. So here, this is probably going to look pretty crude to you. How many of you played Adventure? Okay. All right, so a lot of you haven't. How many of you have never heard of Adventure on the Atari 2600 until now? Okay, a few. All right, so, well, okay. So now, what was your question?
There was some inspiration from a previous text-based game.
Right. All right, so now that that's working, I'll come back there and run through it while I'm talking.
And we're going to do this interactively, so we'll play and talk.
So the capsule history of this game is I was 26 years old. I had just gotten out of graduate school at Berkeley, same place as Frank went, with a master's degree in computer science. I'd gone to Rice University in Texas. I had a pretty good education in computer science, and I had also studied art, which was not a very common combination back then. I got a job at Atari, designing video games. It was my first job out of graduate school, so I was sort of in the right place at the right time. It was a time when nobody really knew which video games were pretty new. They had been invented maybe even back in the 50s or 60s. There were a few prototypes, but commercial video games that people put quarters into were invented in the early 70s. They were called coin-op games in the industry, because you put quarters into them. They were stand-up consoles. Okay. Oh, so it's going flaky on us, huh?
It's flaking out a little bit.
I got a job at Atari when the video game first met the home television set. Okay.
How did you get that job?
Yeah, I'd heard about Atari. I was interested in computer graphics. I had no connections. I'd gone to graduate school in Berkeley, which is 50 miles from Sunnyvale, where Atari was located. I just showed up at the front desk and filled out a job application. And I wrote a paragraph about why I was a perfect guy to design video games at Atari. And they hired me.
And you changed history with that job application.
Yeah?
You have a copy of that paragraph?
I don't. Forgot to bring my pocket photocopier with me back. So the part of the story that Drew asked about was, so the way it worked at Atari, this is kind of hard to imagine for those who know anything about how video games are done now. They're done with big teams, just like movies are done with big teams. But there was a time when movies were done with an individual or a very small number of people. And in the early days at Atari, the video games, the other ones that were done in this same era, were nearly all done by just one person. So you had the idea, you wrote the program, you did the graphics, you created the sounds, you tested it on kids, you debugged it, you decided when it was done, and you handed a floppy disk to somebody, and then they manufactured 100,000 of them and shipped them all over the place. Okay, so that was pretty cool to be given the responsibility to design a complete product. And this box here, the Atari 2600, had a very weak little processor in it, but it had a tiny amount of memory, 4K of ROM, 4,096 bytes of ROM for the game program and the graphics data. Had even smaller RAM memory for variables and things like that, 128 bytes. But it did have a custom chip in it that helped you do the graphics and helped you do sounds. So if you think the graphics are pretty crude looking, well, there was an economic reason. with the weak processor, the tiny memory, the custom chip, this box could sell for $200, and it was well known that consumers would not pay much more than $200. $500, the sales would have been a fraction of what it actually was. So the hardware was as cheap as it could possibly be, and that's why the graphics were crude. And so what is that? What is that yellow thing?
It's a person.
Oh yeah, okay. The yellow square is me, right? It's what we call an avatar nowadays. And why is it not more fancy looking? Because I didn't have the graphics resources to make it more fancy looking.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
All right, so doesn't like me today. So we're going to be bouncing around.
Great.
The way things worked if you were a beginning Atari game designer is you had to come up with a game. And so I did a first game. It was called Slot Racers. You sort of had to do a game that wasn't that great just to, you know, most boxers got knocked out their first match probably. Because the programming the chip, the custom chip inside of it was tricky. And it took some time to get your head around it. And so at the time that I was finishing my first game, which was called Slot Racers, a game of little cars driving around in a maze shooting missiles at each other, I was on the lookout for a new game, and I played what is now considered the original text adventure game. How many of you know what text adventure games are?
The Commodore 64.
Okay, most. Okay. So it's all text. It types a description of where you are, and then you type go north, and then it describes another place where you are, and it says there's a cheerful little bird sitting here singing, and you type take bird, and it says okay, and then it says there's some keys on the ground here, so you type take keys, and it says okay, and then you can move around through this world, and then later on you can use the keys to open the grate. Okay, so you can move. You're imagining this world you're moving through, but it's all text. The descriptions. You have to use your imagination. But you know that you're carrying some stuff because you can take inventory and it'll say, you're carrying keys and cheerful singing bird in a wicker cage. Okay? So I played that, and this took the computer world by storm in 1978. All the nerds were playing it. Okay? A friend of mine who was at MIT said, nobody got any work done for a week. All right? And so I played it, and I was blown away too, because I was one of those nerds, okay? I thought it was the coolest thing I ever saw, and the item in the back of my mind was, what game am I going to do next? Because Atari let the game designer choose the game concept, okay? Because once you chose something, then you had the responsibility to do it in the tiny memory with the crude graphics, okay? So that actually made sense at that time. So I decided I was going to do the adventure game concept with a bunch of rooms that you could move from room to room and objects you could pick up and carry from place to place and use the objects to get past obstacles and monsters in the game world. Okay? So you know what happened? My boss at Atari heard I was working on doing this, and he knew that a text adventure game ran on a mainframe and it took 100K of memory. And the Atari right there had only 4K of memory. So he said, it's impossible. Don't waste your time on it. So what do you think I did? I ignored him. And I made a prototype in secret that was supposed to show him that it actually was feasible on this. A prototype where I was going to show one place as a room on the screen. A lot of the text game took place in a cave, okay? So you could think of it as moving from room to room in a cave. So I was going to show one room at a time on one whole screen like that. And if you moved off the edge, you'd see another room. So you can think of this as go south, okay?
That's so radical.
And then if you went over there, that's like go west. And if you went south again, that's like, okay, so we have no sound. This is a dragon that just ate me. Hey Frank, what happened to our sound?
I turned it down so it conks out and we don't get the big
Yeah, I said add
Oh, okay.
but turn it back up.
All right. Well, we'll play it over here. All right. So that's like going south.
The fact that there's sound at all is amazing.
All right. Now he's chasing me. Okay. And then after a while, either you get away or it eats you. So I don't know if this. I'm going through this pretty fast. I hope this makes sense to you. If you can remember or understand my description of the text adventure game, this was a adaptation from one medium to another.
How long will it take you to show us the Easter egg?
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
With this system, it's not going to happen tonight. Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about the tools that you use to create the assets, especially the tools that you use to create graphics? What machine we're using to write the code?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your dev stack?
Yeah, okay. It was pretty crude, the dev stack. The game was written in assembly language for the 6502 processor, and there was an assembler, but it was a cross assembler. It wasn't running on this system. It was a little micro computer in a box about yay big that you stored your program on a big 8-inch floppy disk, and you could print it out on a line printer. And as far as graphics tools, think graph paper. So the way I drew that, I created that dragon graphics. I drew it on graph paper, and I converted it by hand to hexadecimal numbers. One hexadecimal number per horizontal line, and then I typed it into the source code. And that's about it for the tools. There was a debugger that you could use to single step through your program.
So how did you fit all of this on in this game?
Wait,
So I think I know your answer to this. So you did not develop this on another computer that had a file system, that had directories, that had editors. You were literally poking raw into this thing.
no. I developed it on another computer that did have a file system and did have an editor, and it had a printer. So, it had an assembler. So it had a text editor and an assembler, and I could print the listing.
And an emulator of the Atari?
Well, in a sense, yes. What the development system had was it had a cable that went over here to where the game cartridge usually was. And this game cartridge just has one chip in it, and it's a ROM chip that has memory that's fixed for all time, okay, at manufacturing time. But what the development system had was, instead of a 4K ROM, it had a 4K RAM,
Right.
actually 8K, but so that you could load the program into the RAM. And then it wasn't exactly an emulator because it was using the real hardware, but if we can speak vaguely, we'll call it an emulator. Now, what was your question, Drew?
Are we skitzing out so much?
Okay. Yeah, we're going to make you in charge of making it shut up. Okay? What now?
How did you fit all of this into such a small
How did I fit it in such a small space? I've been asked that question a lot of times, and so the long answer, which is 176,000 words long, is this book that I wrote during the last 2 years. This is only half of it. The other half is an online appendix. It's called The Annotated Adventure. And if you're interested in getting a copy, it's not released yet, but I hope it will be soon. You can send an email to me with annotated in the subject line. And my email address is warren@warrenrobinett.com. Okay, that's the long answer. The short answer is a good data structure and efficient coding. Who asked me that question? Was you? Yeah. Does that answer make sense to anybody?
What data structure? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so 4K is not very much memory by any measure. And to give you a little bit of context, for this game, the 4K had to include the graphics data. So this dragon image, where he's not there now, took about 15 bytes because it was about 15 lines high, and each horizontal line of pixels consumed 1 byte. So the ROM, the 4K ROM, about 1/3 of it was used for graphics. So that left about 2,500 bytes for the actual code itself. And on this processor, instructions were typically 2 or 3 bytes long. So that was about 1,000 machine instructions. So basically you had to make every byte count in this system. And since this was my second game, I did already have a reasonably good understanding of how squeezed in I was. This was kind of like trying to make a 4-course meal in a broom closet. Okay, you couldn't even stick your elbows out. It was, yeah, I'm rambling, but
Let me bring you back around to when you were, was it Simcock who told you not to make the game?
yes.
And you made it anyway.
Yeah, well, I made a prototype that showed it was feasible. And did that convince him it was feasible? No, he was pissed that I had defied him. Okay, but people in the marketing department had seen it, and they thought it was. They said it was different. Okay, and so they told me I could keep working on it. Except they told me I had to turn it into a game about Superman. Now, where did that come from, you ask? Well, so Atari had been started by this hippie-like character named Nolan Bushnell, who was a very nice guy, very off the wall, attention span of a gnat, but very positive, great cheerleader. But Warner he needed money to bring video games to the home market because a big seller in the coin-op era was 10,000 boxes, okay? But there were 30 million television sets across the United States, and so that was, a market that was 100 times bigger. He needed capital, and he got capital from a company called Warner Communications in New York. It was the descendant of the old Warner Brothers movie studio, still around as Time Warner Cable. Okay, and this was big money New York guys, and they basically tricked him and took over his company. Okay, and they brought in an MBA, Harvard MBA, who did make a lot of money at first, but then later on his tactics caused Atari to collapse about 5 years later. So Ray Cassar, did they teach people how to destroy companies at when you get a Harvard MBA? I'm serious.
So they are telling you the game's not feasible. You do the prototype.
Mm-hmm.
And
I do the prototype, and then they see, some of the people there see that it has some potential. It works. You can carry objects from room to room. I didn't have much in the prototype. I had about 6 screens worth, or maybe 8, and I had one object you could carry around and one dragon that would chase you, but nothing happened when he caught you. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't supposed to be a complete game. It was just supposed to show that you could do rooms and objects, and you could pick up objects, and it showed how the user interface worked. With one joystick, with one button on it, it wasn't 100% clear before trying it that you could make it work. Okay, so what happened with the Superman thing is, well, what do you think happened? I guess you know that I didn't make Superman because you're here to. What happened was, well, how many of you have heard the phrase "stubborn as a Missouri mule"? Okay, yeah. Well, so I had this idea that I wanted to make a sort of a quest-like game with dragons, and I wanted to do what Don Woods and Willie Crowther, the adventure of the Tex Adventure game, had done. They had made this really cool world. It was set in a cave, and it had monsters, and it had magic, and I wanted to do that thing, okay? And so every time we had a meeting and the idea came up about the adventure game, I said, I'll do that. I don't want to do that, but I'll do it if I have to. And the 4th time I said it, one of my coworkers, who was also an Atari game designer, said, hey, I'll take over your code and do the Superman game, and then you can do the Dungeons and Dragons game. And George was sitting there. He was frowning, but somebody had volunteered to do it, and so that's what happened. John Dunn took over the code and made the Superman cartridge, which came out about the same time as Adventure did, and I was allowed to keep working on my concept. And then, all right, so okay, I wasn't exactly given permission to do it. I just wasn't forbidden to do what I wanted to do, so I kept working on it. And I made some more rooms, and I made a few objects, and I sort of looked up a few months later, and I'd only used 2/3 of the memory, so I wasn't out of memory, but the game was stupid. And I didn't know how to make it unstupid. I was puzzled. And so what I actually did was I went off and worked on a separate cartridge for 4 months and just sort of put the problems of adventure in the back of my mind. And since nobody wanted the game with the dragons and stuff, nobody was pressuring me to finish it. I think George hoped I would just forget about it. And so the other cartridge I was working on was a BASIC interpreter. It was eventually called BASIC Programming. Did anybody here ever play BASIC Programming? Wow. It's pretty hard to use, wasn't it? So I eventually did have, and what was needed, so this is the problem that every Atari 2600 game designer faced, actually, is you had this machine with some pretty crude graphics resources and a very limited set of sounds it could make, and a tiny little memory, weak processor, and you had to come up with a concept that you could implement within those limited resources that was actually fun to play, okay?
And you've got a boss undercutting you and telling you not to do it.
I didn't care about him.
Clearly. So you left at one point.
Well, no, that's later. That's after, but we're still on finishing the game.
Okay.
So it wasn't a unique problem I faced trying to figure out how to make an interesting game, but I did have this partially built game. I was inspired by the text adventure. I thought I could port it over onto this. This is a different medium, you might say. And of course, there are problems porting it into a new medium, but there was additional problems because of the limited resources. So I had to come up with something that would fit in the amount of memory I had left, some ideas that were efficient in terms of amount of memory it took and the amount of the computing time it took, because I was limited in that way too. And so I guess I'll describe some of those ideas I had before we're done tonight. Should we complete the top level story now first?
Sure. Let's do the summary and then we'll go into the weeds.
Okay. In spite of all the pushback I got, it turned out to be pretty good. Sold 1 million copies, $25 each. The royalty I got was 0, and I got paid $20,000 a year. Was something. I mean, it was like the Dickens novel. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times, because they were paying me to design video games. That's the best of times, right? But they won't give me any public credit. That's the worst of times. Okay.
So your name's not on the box. It's not.
Yeah, my name. They wouldn't put your name on the box. They wouldn't, or in the game. No in-game credit. No on the box credit. You didn't exist. I knew what was going to happen when this game came out. When it was finally done, and I knew it was going to be manufactured, the box was going to say "Adventure" by Atari. Okay. So, what do you do in a situation like that? And is it? Yeah, it does say "Adventure." Well, okay, it has Warren Robinett on there because I signed it. But for the first 37 years, it said "Adventure" by Atari. Okay. So, what are you going to do in a situation like that? And is it clear to you all why they weren't giving the game designers any public credit? Because if the public knew who we were, they might start asking for our work. We might ask for royalties. We might get uppity. So it was a power play to push us down, give us no public credit, no royalties. We weren't much to look at. They thought we were replaceable. In fact, the CEO, so about 1980, the CEO, Ray Kassar, that Harvard MBA guy, told the guy that there were 4 guys that made, Atari was starting to make a lot of money in the early 80s, okay? And in 1980 through 1983, it made $500 million of profit for its parent corporation, Warner Communications, okay? And $500 million is real money back in 1980, maybe even now, okay? And so, how much did it make in 1980? $50 million profit, maybe? There were 4 programmers, my fellow designers, who had made all of, more than half of that profit was attributable to these 4 guys. And they looked at the sales numbers and saw this, and they were friends. They were part of the original crew of game designers. And so they went to talk to the CEO and said that they should be getting some kind of cut, some kind of royalties. They produced half of this $50 million profit, or whatever it was. And Ray Kassar, the CEO, said, "You guys are no more important to Atari than the guys that assemble the cartridges on the assembly line." How about that? So what do you think they did?
They started Activision.
Yeah, they quit and they started a competing company called Activision. And how did they do? Atari sued them, of course, but they had gotten some capital. Even back then, Silicon Valley had venture capitalists, so they had a bit of money at hand. And so Atari sued them, and their lawyers fought back, and they made $50 million of profit in the following year. Or maybe it was a year after that. They had a legal fight for a year, and then, anyway, in 81, I think it was, Activision made $50 million profit. And what do you think happened the next year? 3 more Atari game designers leave and start another company, and they made $50 million of profit their first year in 1982. iMagic. And what do you think happened the next year? All the Atari game designers left except one, and 30 companies started up to make Atari 2600 cartridges. And then what happened? Most of those companies couldn't make a game worth of shit. So the market was flooded with garbage video games. There were a lot of games for $2 or $3 in the bin at Toys R Us, and then the ones Atari and Activision were selling cost $25 or $30. But if you were a dad and it was Christmas time, would you buy one $30 game, or would you buy 5 $3 games? So, and all the profit was in the cartridges. They were selling the console unit, the base unit, at cost. It had expensive stuff inside of it, but the cartridge only had this one chip, and otherwise it was just a plastic shell. So, and Atari had no good game designers left. They had all left. Okay, so their games were crap. So the power play didn't work so well for Mr. Kassar, did it? And what happened to Atari? Well, it made $500 million of profit from 1980 roughly to 1983, and then during 83, 84, tell me if this means anything to you. Yeah. No, really, they were losing $1 million a day in the middle of 1983. I had a girlfriend who worked over there, so she was telling me what was going on. And $1 million a day it's kind of serious. So they laid off people, but they're still losing money hand over fist. A series of layoffs over a period of 1 year reduced. Atari had become bloated during the years when it was making all this money. I don't know why they felt they had to hire you know. So many, but they had 10,000 employees in '83, and a year later they had 100 employees. So that's pretty much a complete,
Yeah.
well, maybe not complete crash, but it's pretty near complete.
So where's Adventure in all of this?
Well, Adventure made 25 million of that 500 million profit.
And you got,
I got a salary, roughly 20,000 a year, and so perhaps you can see why. After now, did I get to the part where I hid my name in the game?
no, we're getting there.
Oh yeah, okay. So what do you do if there's a big one-eyed giant with a club 8 feet long that, you know, or a big rich money guy from New York with a Harvard MBA and lawyers out the wazoo is telling you that you can't have your name on the game and you can't get any public credit and you're not getting any royalties. Did I tell you they promised us all 10 cents per cartridge royalty? That our first, when I was hired, I was promised a royalty.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of I guess we could call it a bait and switch royalty at this point. So anyway, what do you do in that situation? You don't, you didn't have too many options, but that's thinking like a helpless victim to think you have no options.
Mm-hmm.
And I come from the Ozarks, okay? And if you all have not been to southern Missouri, the Ozarks were traditionally full of mean hillbillies. You didn't want to screw with them, okay? Would Granny Clampett have rolled over and played dead? Hell no, she would have walked in there with her shotgun and blown a hole in the ceiling, right?
You didn't do this.
Well, that was my birth culture attitude, okay? So, no, I didn't do that. What I did was I hid my name in the game. Okay, so I made this adventure game. It had all these rooms. It had 30 different rooms, okay? And had about 20 objects you could pick up and move from place to place. It was pretty complicated, and some of the objects were used as keys to unlock doors to get into other places. So I just made one secret room that was really hard to get into, and I made an object that if you could read it, it had to be vertical, but it was vertical text and it said created by Warren Robinett. Okay, and I hid it in a room that was very hard to get into. I'll tell you how you got into it in a second. And then once they got in there, I made it fill the screen and it was flashing colors like a movie marquee, because why not? What you had to do to get into it was the game had several mazes in it. I haven't shown you the mazes yet, but some of you have played Adventure. So the mazes, were a bit tricky to navigate through. And one of the mazes had a little chamber, and there was an object called the bridge you could use to cross walls in the maze. Mm-hmm. So I had one maze that had a little isolated chamber. It wasn't visually obvious that it wasn't connected to any of the other paths, but it wasn't. So you had to use the bridge to cross the wall to get into the isolated chamber, and in that isolated chamber was a 1-pixel dot.
Mm.
That was like the smallest possible object. Okay, that was nobody's laughing, but it was a joke. It was a little tiny crumb that was magic. Okay, because when something's magic, it doesn't matter how big it is. Right? Okay, and if you got that little crumb, that dot, and took it to another place, you could get through another wall. So the dot acted as a key to get through another wall, and then you got into the secret room. So I did this. I didn't tell anyone because I was tempted to tell my office mate, Jim Heather. But then I thought, then the devil appeared on my shoulder like in Animal House, and he said, Warren, you dumbass, if you can't even keep the secret yourself, how can you expect Jim to keep the secret? And I said, you're right. So I didn't tell anybody. I handed it in. Here you go, George. And then I quit a few days later because I was being treated like a bad employee. I thought I had done a good job, And it was a successful game, but I was being treated like a bad employee by my immediate boss, and people at the top were screwing all of the Atari game designers. So perhaps some of you think you were a bad employee. But, it's a matter of judgment, I guess. But it didn't seem fair to me. Yeah?
You haven't told us the secret sauce that turned your crap game into adventure.
Okay. Very good. Okay. I'll get to that next, okay? But have we finished the secret room story?
Did you expect anyone to find it? As far as we know, it's the first Easter egg, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't call it an Easter egg. I called it my signature. Like a painter puts down in the corner of a painting, Like, people have been putting their names on their artistic creations for about 5,000 years, or maybe 30,000.
Frank,
It's not
was
a
your
new
name on the
idea.
skyscraper?
There was a message to my wife.
Was it?
There you go.
Awesome.
Did I expect it to be found? Well, I did think it was pretty obscure. I wasn't. It was, to some extent, it was an experiment to see if any kid would find it. But if no kid had found it in the first year, I could have just revealed the secret to 2 or 3 kids, and then the word would have spread. So it was going to be found.
So you're really talking about this as sort of your creation that you felt very attached to the design of it.
Yeah.
Was that attitude common among the designers,
Yeah.
or was that something that you were? It was unique?
Well, yes, I think it was. Yeah. But the Atari game designers got into it because you were given the creative freedom and also the responsibility to implement it and make it fun. It was a perfect. That was the best of times part. Yeah.
Going on the design aspect a little bit, the dragon sound when you get eaten by the dragon is so iconic. And I know a lot of video games that have come in the future, especially a lot of indie design games, use that sound, like a riff on that sound.
Really?
I can't remember the name of it, but I know it's like a death sound or like a modern version of it.
Huh.
So what I want to know is, what was your inspiration for kind of making those sounds? Because I know that you had to do all that yourself. And how do you feel as kind of now being included in that realm of inspirers who make other people who draw on your game as their source of inspiration?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to get back to the secret sauce question before too long. So the sound hardware was one thing that might surprise some people is the sound hardware didn't let you make any possible recorded sound like most computer sound systems do now. It just had a few parameters you could set, and then it would generate a sound based on those 3 parameters. Okay, and the parameters were frequency. It had a 5-bit register you could write into, and it would give you one of 32 frequencies. It had a 4-bit volume, it would give you one of 16 volumes, and then it had a 4-bit sort of a spectral register that would determine what the sound quality. It could give you a roar or a buzz. So I was trying to figure out a way to make a dragon voice using those parameters. And there were a few days when I was sitting in my office making mouth sounds because I could make a sound that had a particular set of those 3 parameters, and then I could, if I wanted the frequency to go down every successive frame, I'd just reduce that frequency count by 1, and then I'd get a rapid series of decreasing frequencies, and it would sound like okay. And if I did it the reverse time order, it'd be so. I was trying to, when the dragon ate you, I was trying to make an sound. So I was sitting in my office going, Well, see, that had a pitch contour. Right? So I was trying to duplicate that pitch contour. And when you died, what do you do when you die? You go, ah! Well, I couldn't do that. So I was eventually I had something that sounded more like an explosion than anything else. I actually was rather disappointed with the death sound, the biting sound, but I was out of memory and pissed off and ready to quit. So I just accepted the death sound for the biting sound as it was. I didn't actually like it. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk just for a minute about the RAM in the machine? Because I know the bat number of was flying around off screen,
Yeah.
which was really kind of unique. So it's out stealing objects in other rooms while you're somewhere else.
Well, now you're into the secret sauce. But what was your question about the RAM?
Well, just about how you did that, because
Yeah,
it doesn't seem that. How much RAM did the machine have?
128 bytes.
And so it was keeping track of the bat moment by moment for the entire game.
Yeah.
It's
Well-
less than a tweet.
Huh?
It's less than a tweet.
Yeah. Way less than a tweet. The
I
whole
guess that
the
was my
whole
question.
RAM was less than a tweet. Yeah.
So I didn't know if it was actually tracking it, or if you gave the illusion that it was tracking it. Because when I went into another room later, things have changed. But you're saying it was actually keeping
Well, I
track
wouldn't
of
call
the
it
time.
I wouldn't call it tracking it. I'd call it simulating it.
Okay.
It was simulating all the creatures and objects in the game continuously.
all the time.
And what was on the display was whether or not you were looking at a particular object did not affect what it was doing. Simulation ran independently of which room was being viewed.
I always assumed that was an illusion, that you didn't have the memory to do that, that we were just giving us the impression of it.
No, I had the memory. So maybe I should tell you the numbers, because if you want to read about it in nauseating detail, there's this book here. But I refreshed my own memory when I was writing this book. So to record the location of one object that was not animated and didn't do much, like a key, for example. A key did do something, but it didn't. But to remember where it was in the game world, it required 3 bytes: an x coordinate, a y coordinate, and a room number. Okay, so that little 3-byte, we'd call it a struct in C terms. That little 3-byte struct I used for all of the objects. Okay, so it only cost me 3 bytes to position a movable object somewhere. All right, and the dragon had a state that cost an extra byte, and it had a direction it was currently moving in. That was a byte. So each dragon cost 5 bytes of RAM, and the bat was basically implemented as a dragon with some extra behavior and different graphics. So the bat had 2 more bytes. So the bat required 7 bytes of RAM. So it was a tight world I lived in. I had to make every byte count. Okay. So, but that was really pretty efficient to only have 3 or 5 or 7 bytes for each object that had a different behavior and function in the game. So I was like Ebenezer Scrooge with my memory. I did not let go of a penny unless it was wrenched out of my hand by an unstoppable force. That makes any sense.
So is that the secret sauce?
Let's talk about secret sauce. So maybe
Power off.
power off. Okay. All right. So let's do game 2. All right. So what is that black thing? Somebody.
Number of
Yeah, but the bat. Yeah. Okay. Does that look like a bat? Well,
Mostly.
this hardware's not going to cooperate with us. So the bat's carrying the sword, that yellow thing. Let's try again. What's causing this problem? Is it going through the? It's going through a video
Going through a
converter.
VCR so we can project, but it seems to happen most when there's more activity on the screen, so the signal weakens up and then.
So the Atari box after decades was working just fine. But
Yes.
It's projected next to it.
Yeah. Yes, I think the Atari box is working
If we were
just
running
fine.
this on just a CRT screen, there'd be no problem. We're
All
trying
right.
to project is the problem.
All right. So there's a dragon. Now let's. I know how he works, so I can deal with him just fine. All right, so this is the sword. So first I'll show you, I'll just show you what happens. So the dragon, if you have no sword, the dragon can chase you around. If he catches you and you don't jump away fast enough, he'll eat you. If you have the sword, oh, okay, so now the difficulty switches. So there's two difficulty switches, and you just saw what happens when it's in the difficult setting. The dragon will eat you if you have no sword, and if you do have a sword, he'll run from the sword. And this is part of the secret sauce. So you've seen me get eaten, and you haven't seen me kill a dragon. Okay, let's do that.
You're on 1.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe the secret sauce wants to stay.
Well, I can talk you through the secret sauce, but I think it would be more effective if I show you first. So now I've got a sword. You've seen me get eaten. All right, all you have to do is touch the sword of the dragon and it's dead, okay? So I don't have to show you that again. So here's what I was calling the secret sauce, okay? I had this game with rooms and objects, and that was working. But I needed to invent some objects that were interesting to a player, okay? I had a bit of memory left. Wasn't out of memory. And I was puzzled for a while what to do. And it wasn't just one, the secret sauce wasn't just one idea, it was a combination of ideas. All right? So I'm going to describe my thinking with respect to the dragon, okay? When I had done my prototype that was supposed to show my boss the idea was feasible, I had a very small world with 6 or 8 rooms, and I had maybe 1 or 2 objects that you could pick up and move around, and I had this dragon that would chase me from room to room. Now that was pretty cool, but when he caught me, nothing happened, okay? Well, that obviously was no good, right? Is that obvious? It was like a large fly buzzing around your head. If you moved, it would follow you, and it was still on top of you. But it was like a novel with no conclusion, you know. So, all right. So my solution, you've already seen it. I decided to have the dragon eat you, and I made a hole in his stomach so you could see. Let me show you that. You know what happens when the dragon eats you?
Mm-hmm.
This is starting to irritate me. Okay. Oh, come on.
Oh no, look out.
Now, see, I can still try to move. I'm in his stomach, so that's funny. When I don't think I planned that, but when I saw it, I liked it. Okay, so you all laughed. It was funny. Okay, so all right. Once I was at that point, that was pretty good as far as it went. But you can't just end the game once you've been eaten one time, right? So there had to be a way to come back to life. It's obvious, right? Isn't it? Well, I didn't have much tradition to guide me, but to me it was obvious. So, and I'd already used up the joystick lever and the button. The button dropped objects, so I took over one of these other levers, and I used one of the console switches, and it would bring you back to life, okay? And it brought back to life all the dragons you might have killed. All right? So now this is better because you could encounter dragons. You might get away from them. They might eat you, but you could come back to life. But it was still kind of irritating because the dragon would eat you again and again and again and again. You know, he was like the Grim Reaper. It wasn't quite the Grim Reaper, but he was like the biggest, meanest bully you ever encountered that you always got beaten up by and you had no hope of ever winning. Yeah, that was it. You had no hope of ever winning against the dragon, and I didn't like that, okay? So that's why I invented the sword. So I went through these three or four steps. Dragon, Well, I just described them. So once there was a sword, then sometimes you could kill the dragon and you won. Other times the dragon would eat you, but you could come back to life and try again. So that was actually pretty good. I thought the dragon was complete at that point. I didn't feel that it needed any more work. So that was one part of the secret sauce. And then because I had such a small amount of memory for these objects in the game world, including the dragon, only 5 bytes, it's pretty easy to just replicate the dragon, use the same code. I made them 3 different colors, red, green, and yellow. I named them Grindel, Rindel, and Yorgel for the colors. Okay, but just taking the existing code and the existing behavior and just making 3 instances of the dragon added quite a bit of complexity to the game at very little, almost.
So that particular last bit, one of the motivations that Simula people talked about for inventing Simula was doing simulation. So if you want you to find a car, you can have N cars.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to find a dragon, how you can have N dragons.
That's right.
Now, I mean, I sort of think objects is not novel or exciting. I just do them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was that repeated code, was that influenced at all by people talking about OO, or was that just you saying, dude, I got the same code, I just do it again?
Well, that's a good question. And I have a chapter in my book about was adventure object-oriented or not, but I'll tell you the answer now.
Now I know I have to buy the book, so let's move on.
Oh, I might as well tell you the answer. You're not all going to buy the book. Well, C++ didn't exist yet. It was being invented at that exact same time, the very first version of C++. But I had studied computer science. I had heard of Simula, but I never programmed in it. And so I did reflect on this a little bit, and here's the conclusion I came to. Yeah, and by the way, I learned when I was a grad student at Berkeley. I took a course from Ken Thompson and learned C the 1 year that Ken Thompson was at Berkeley. So that was pretty lucky, actually. I had very little interest in operating systems, to tell you the truth, but I did take that one course, and learning C was at the very beginning was great. And I think I learned the data layout that was used in C structs at that time. And so I did use a data layout that's exactly like how it's done in C. So in a way, you could say that I made my own version of object-oriented structures. You could say that, but here's what I say. I'm going to ask the question, where did object-oriented programming come from? And where it came from was what?
I was going to say small talk.
Well, yeah, Alan Kay was. It came from Alan. Alan Kay was an inventor of it, but there was what's his name who invented Simula before Alan Kay. What's his name?
Yeah.
That guy. That guy in Scandinavia. Here's what I think I had. Where object-oriented programming came from was programmers struggling with how to get their programs to work well and inventing techniques back in the prehistory of computer programming. And I was one of those programmers that was struggling to find a way to make multiple objects. And I found a way that was pretty similar to what was done in Simula and Smalltalk and C++. So I claim that what I did was just part of the primordial ooze from which emerged object-oriented programming.
Another question no one else has. So this is all Silicon Valley we're talking about, right? You're in now.
Yeah, I was in
Okay.
Sunnyvale.
And
Yeah.
what year is, just remind me the year here.
78, 79.
Okay, so the first Smalltalk interpreter was 72, Xerox PARC was going off. What were the exciting ideas in the air at the time?
Well, working for Atari was pretty exciting to me. Getting paid, video game. So I had an offer from Hewlett Packard at that time to develop firmware for printing data terminals. So can you see why I chose a game at Atari instead of data terminals? So that wasn't one of the exciting ideas. Huh?
Not the DARPA experiments, nothing else. I mean, you clearly thought you were doing, the leading edge of stuff, but was anything else in the air around you?
Of course. Well, I thought I was working on something that had possibilities. I didn't know what they were. I wouldn't have bet money that video games were going to be bigger than film and music ever. That sure didn't. None of us knew where it was going, but it was interesting. It was different. It was fun, and the company was pretty fun at first before the money people took over. But you want to know what was in the air? Well, I lived in Menlo Park, California, which was right next to Stanford University, and the stuff going on at the AI lab was pretty exciting. That was my housemate worked at the AI lab. He was working on computer music. He was writing his dissertation on computer models of the violin, and the AI people were, they were planning to make computer programs and robots that were smarter than people. Was just around the corner. That's what they thought. Frank was there too at Berkeley. All computer people thought that they were going to write that AI wasn't that hard, and in a decade or two we'll have machines that are smarter than us. But they weren't worried. They should have been worried about that, but they weren't.
I mean, one thing that I'll add, I don't know if this answers your question or not, but something that I sort of perceived. So I did my undergraduate at Berkeley. This would have been 88 to 95. I did my graduate work at Carnegie Mellon, 95 to 2001. At Berkeley, I was playing games. I mean, I wasn't really studying at the time. Basement lab, a computer science lab. These were like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 Sun Spark stations that regular people had access to. We were playing network computer game with 16 other people, and this is a time of like 12K baud modems, right? So there was a big disconnect between the computer stuff that I had access to as a student in undergraduate years versus what was available to outside. And that was true even at Carnegie Mellon. So at that time I was deeply into Quake World, and we were basically hosting our servers in the fastest internet in the world at the time. So much so that when we had Unreal Tournament, people from Epic would log onto our servers because we had such a fast network, like the Cliffy.
So what were the hot ideas that got you excited?
Well, it wasn't so much ideas as opposed to it was a really weird disconnect. But if you look at now, there really isn't a difference between what's available in schools and what's available to regular people. I mean, to sort of commercial. So that technology gap has sort of converged to a point. So stuff that are exciting to me are, so augmented reality as sort of it's coming down the pipeline and so on, where you're sort of mixing physical and digital world. But it was just kind of like a weird disconnect in my mind. I remember it's like in the basement labs just playing this game all night, NetTrek, all night, and sort of essentially experiencing something that even at the time I realized that no one else really had access to, except few select people throughout universities, right, that had these fast.
Well, I'll tell you what excited me. In my opinion, back in the mid '70s and late '70s, the AI people, Marvin Minsky at MIT and John McCarthy at Stanford, they had the mind share for the wildest but maybe actually possible stuff you might do with computers, and it was artificial intelligence, because the idea was we're going to figure out how the human mind works, which is exciting in itself, and simulate it on computers and make intelligent entities. And who the hell? And we're still trying to do that. It's taking longer than they thought, but it seemed like it was just around the corner back then. And maybe you had a different view, perhaps, of what was exciting than I did. But trying to understand how the human mind works is pretty damn intellectually exciting. I thought making video games was fun, and you could even say that I didn't tell you about the way my dragons made decisions, did I?
So what was your job after Atari?
let's see.
I think
I was
we're-
kind of
we might have about 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay.
Is that right, Jim?
Yeah, actually, maybe like more like 10, so we have enough time to wrap up.
Okay.
So
Okay.
maybe like 1 or 2 more questions. or-
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Well, okay, we'll take that as one of the questions. I took a year off to recover my sanity and equilibrium. And I ended up meeting 3 women who wanted to make educational games, and we started a company called The Learning Company to make educational games. And we got venture capital. It had some ups and downs, but it was pretty successful. It went public 15 years later. It made me some money. My protege, Leslie Grimm, I taught her. I was a card-carrying game designer. I had 3 commercial Atari games on the shelves, and you learn a lot when you've done 3. It's like having 3 books under your belt. So I taught Leslie some things about game design, and she did 15 successful educational games, including Reader Rabbit. How many of you have heard of Reader Rabbit? How many of you use Learning Company products? Okay. Now, starting a company was pretty damn hard on me. I was there for 3 years, and I didn't believe in stress before I went to that company, but I learned it was real. So I had to take 3 years off after that.
And you were at NASA for a while.
Yeah, that was my next job after the 3 years of recovering from the startup company. I got a job at NASA doing what we now call virtual reality. So you're looking at a very spoiled boy. I have gotten paid to do what I wanted to do, fun technical research projects, my entire career. There's only been one job I had in my career that I hated. Anybody want to guess what it was? CEO of a startup company. Some people like that sort of thing, but I didn't.
You had mentioned the dragon movement.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that the bat was basically a modified dragon.
Yeah.
How did you do the bat movement? It seems so random.
Yeah. So,
Great question.
yeah, that is a great question. I'm glad we didn't hit our time limit before that question. So, there's one thing I didn't get to about the secret sauce question. My pondering about how to make the game more interesting. So I had objects, and some of the objects I would make them move around on their own, so I called them creatures, but they were still sort of specialized objects. So they had these positions, X, Y, and which room they were in. They could cross room boundaries if they were going in a certain direction and pop into the next room. My good idea for how to make the game more interesting was I realized that so I had this dragon that would chase you when it wasn't dead. It had a state, so sometimes it's dead, or sometimes it had eaten you. But if neither of those was true, then it was chasing you. But I said that I was satisfied with that earlier, but actually I wasn't completely satisfied with it because it was sort of unidimensional. It chased you and chased you. That's all it did. It chased you for all eternity. Okay? And so I remembered something I had been taught in science class. How many of you have heard of behaviorism?
B.F. Skinner.
Yeah? So what does behaviorism mean? What is it?
Input output strictly.
Yeah. It was an idea that you could describe animal behavior with stimulus response rules. And so I remembered that idea and the stimulus response rules, and I realized it could apply to my game world. And so the stimuli that I decided to use were just whether an object was in the same room or not with the square, the avatar. Okay? That's a stimulus. And the response rules, I used 2. One was to chase that thing that was in the same room with you, and the other was to flee from it. And one stimulus response rule could be used to describe the dragon as it originally existed, right? But if you add some more stimulus response rules, then you get a dragon that it will chase the avatar, except if it sees a sword, it will run away from it. And then I prioritized the stimulus response rules, and it was just a list of them, and it would go down the list till it found an object in the same room with whatever it was chasing. And then it would look and see whether they were supposed to chase it or run away from it. And so this meant that each of my active creatures, that's the 3 dragons and the bat, and the magnet was also actually implemented with the same software. They had these complex behaviors that required 2 bytes for each stimulus response rule, because I used 1 byte to describe who was responding and the second byte to describe what the object was supposed to chase or run away from. The stimulus response, I call this a chase-flee list. So it's a prioritized list of objects and whether to go towards or away from each one. So here's the kind of thing that would happen. The bat you had the sword, the bat's chasing you, and it's going to steal your sword. But then another object comes into the room that's higher priority, and the bat, you could see it change its mind and go off in a different direction. And I can put change its mind in quotes, but this changing its mind was just built into its priority list, so it made sense. And so each of the 3 dragons didn't have identical behaviors because they each had their own priority list. They had similar behaviors, but the green dragon would sit on top of the black key, and players would say it was guarding it. Okay, and the red dragon would sit on top of the white key and guard it. And the yellow dragon was scared of the sword. So they were slightly different. And that was the secret sauce, the chase-flee priority list.
I mean, though you might not call it that, that's basically an AI program, right? It's just describing
behavior. I didn't think of that at the time, because nowadays when the ruling clique in AI is embodied intelligence, so they would call it AI. But Minsky and what's his name wouldn't have, I don't think. McCarthy, yeah.
Well, I'm going to cut us off there, but I do want to note one thing, that during Warren's session with students yesterday, he was about to talk about this exact sort of function, and the dragon had eaten the man, and right as he's about to say this, the bat flies by, picks up the dragon, and starts flying around the screen right behind him, and he turned around and he went, huh. And everybody was sort of amazed by that, because, and I think that's a beautiful moment where the sort of thing that you made still surprises you, still sort of does these weird things. And I think that, to me, that's the secret sauce of adventure, that there are these emergent things that happen because of the rules written into the game. So
yes, and let me give you a phrase to describe that. Interactive graphical simulation. And all 3 of those words are important, because the simulation is what everybody liked, that it was a believable world, right, where things happened off screen. The simulation was taking place irrespective of which screen you were seeing. Okay, and the fact that it was graphical, you can just understand it and empathize with it when it's visual much more easily than if it was a table of numbers or something. And the fact that it was interactive and you could screw around with it and do things, those 3 elements are pretty good mix. I mean, it describes all of video games in a way, but not people don't emphasize the simulation aspect so much, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree. Well,
yes or no question. Could somebody make their own game by themselves and say they're not a success today, given today's technology? Yes or no?
Well, I'm conducting that experiment because I'm attempting to make a sequel to this, and I'm doing it by myself, so
stay tuned.
Find out.
Andrew has been too humble to this point to mention that one of the reasons this whole event happened is that Andrew wrote a book. It's right here. It's called Bit by Bit. It doesn't actually even come out until May 2nd, but because you are here and because Andrew is here, you get to walk home with a copy of it. In this book, he talks to Warren about adventure. He talks to a lot of really...
Talk to Frank.
He talks to Frank. He talks to a lot of very interesting people about the history of video games. It's called Bit by Bit, How Video Games Transformed Our World. It's got a beautiful cover. It's blurbed by amazing people like Amber Sparks and Ian Bogos and Ernie Klein and Tom Bissell. So, and maybe on your way out, the author will sign it for you. But we have those on the way out. I know a few people are going to be taking the shuttle back to the hotel here at 8, so that's why I'm sort of trying to wrap things up. But I just want to say thank you all for coming. thank you all for having this amazing conversation. This has been a great day for us, a very exciting step forward for the arcade, and we hope that we'll be able to keep doing this year in and year out and invite people, very interesting people like you, to come and share fantastic work. So thank you very much. A round of applause for